Hello, I'm not the Doctor, because I'm not British, even though, the Doctor's an alien from another planet. But yeah, in all seriousness, I'm a big fan of Doctor Who, so I decided to do a Doctor Who video on my channel. And I'm going to answer a question, and that question simply is, how long has the Doctor lived? Because the Doctor has been portrayed by 14 different actors, going all the way back to when the show started in 1963. And the Doctor has lived for a very long time, but there is not a perfect consensus on the Doctor's age, at least currently. At the time that I'm recording this, Jodi Whittaker's first season is over, and we're in that time where, once again, we got to go a year before we get to the next season. So I've decided to do some research, and I think I figured out the Doctor's age. So, yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this video in parts. Each part I'm going to talk about every actor who's portrayed the Doctor in order, and then just simply try and figure out how long did the Doctor live when the Doctor was portrayed by that actor. Not just like, oh, the Doctor was 3 seasons with this actor, 5 seasons with this actor. No, like, how many years did the Doctor actually live, and what's the Doctor's total age? So, a couple rules. I did a lot of research for this one, and I'm going off what I could find. Now, most of the information I could get, I found through wikis, including the official Doctor Who wiki. Now, a lot of the information is mentioned for the age is mentioned in the show itself, but a few of the ages I had to find came from like novels, audio dramas, comics, or outside stories. But the problem is, not all outside stories for Doctor Who are considered canon, so it was kind of hard to figure out which ones are considered canon, which ones are not. And plus, even within the Doctor themselves, they don't always give like a consistent age, so it was really hard to determine what is the Doctor's age. So I had to look up other, websites of people who try to figure out the age to determine, is this information canon or not. But I think I figured it out. Oh, and by the way, if I were fortunate enough to be hired to be on Doctor Who, or be, do an Americanized version of Doctor Who, this would probably be what I would do. Just black suit, black tie, and then, just a colorful plaid shirt, because I wear a lot of plaid shirts, so. But yeah, this is basically how I would basically be as the Doctor in my outfit. But yeah. So, like I said, I'm going to go all in order, do all the Doctors. Now, this will nowhere be anywhere near as long as my Power Rangers video, thank God. But yeah, so, not much else to say. Let's get into it and figure out the answer to the question, how long has the Doctor lived? The first Doctor, William Hartnell. Now, a lot of information about the first Doctor's life has been revealed after Hartnell was no longer the Doctor. But I was able to... But for the most part, it is easy to figure out exactly the first Doctor's life. So here's what we know. The first Doctor entered the Academy, which all Time Lords on Gallifrey enter at the age of 8, as mentioned by the 10th Doctor in The Sound of Drums. Additionally, the 11th Doctor's prose, Shroud of Sorrows, mentioned that he left primary school at the age of 45. Now, the 4th Doctor had a comic where he mentioned he was a teenager for 50 years. But we don't know exactly when a Time Lord's teenage years begin. The closest I could find was that, also in the comic, it said he was 63, but does that mean he was a teenager? Did he's no longer a teenager? I don't know. Like I said, it's a comic, so I don't know if it's considered canon or not. And the comic was the Time Witch. But the 10th Doctor later mentioned that he visited the Medusa Cascade at the age of 90 in the Stolen Earth. Now, the problem is he said he was still a kid here. Now, does that mean that I think he meant he was not an adult yet, because even if you go off the assumption that Time Lords still live as children for 50 years, the fact he still sees himself as a kid, now true, this is the 10th Doctor saying this, that's still a very weird length of her childhood. And the closest consensus I could find online for when the Doctor, like all Time Lords, become adults, is anywhere between the age 100 and 150. So I couldn't find an exact age of when the first Doctor reached adulthood, but it's just somewhere around that time. Now, there are two, let me rephrase this. The first Doctor stole the TARDIS when he was the age 236, and there are 2 instances that confirm this to be true. Once in Old Who and once in New Who. In the 4th Doctor episode, The Rivals Operation, whenever he's meeting Romana, she brings up how he had been traveling in the TARDIS for hundreds of years. Now, I'll get back into this when I talk about the 4th Doctor. And then once again, in the 11th Doctor era episode, The Name of the Doctor, we see the flashback to when the first Doctor, who was an old man, with Susan, stealing the TARDIS. So again, this is the commonly accepted age amongst fandom, that the Doctor was 236 when he stole the TARDIS and left Gallifrey. Now, as for his time on the show, his first, when he actually was the Doctor in the show in the 1960s, there's very little mention of the Doctor's age. All we know is that he's a wise old man, although a bit of a frumpy old man, to be fair, and that he and Susan have been traveling for a while, settling in 1960s London before they meet Ian and Barbara. So again, we don't know his exact age, but again, at least a couple of decades, maybe even as many as almost half a century has gone by before the show actually finally begins. Now, for the most part, time seems to go at a normal pace for the first Doctor. Now, there might have been some off-screen adventures, including in the modern era, where we now are getting a lot of audio dramas with Susan's actor, as well as a few actors and a few other actors and actresses returning for Big Finish productions. But again, there's very little mention of the first Doctor's age. But in the show, and this leads to one of several fan theories, some personal but some I found online, that I have for the show. In the Season 3 episode, The Daleks' Master Plan, which was Hartnell's final full season, because he did do like the beginning of Season 4, but it was only like for the first couple stories. Now, in the Daleks' Master Plan, the first Doctor begins aging faster by the Time Destructor, because that's the same Time Destructor that killed one of his companions. I forgot the name of the companion, but one of his companions basically turned very old and turned to dust because of the Time Destructor. So there is a fan theory by some, and I'm going to agree here, that the first Doctor, while he was already an old man, the Time Destructor sped up his aging. So by this point, the first Doctor was probably at least 300 years old. And this also leads to another fan theory I'm going to bring up throughout this video, that Time Lords, an average lifespan, like an average incarnation length, would be about 1,000 Earth years. I'm going to get into more detail in the future, but I'm going to stick with that for now, so just keep that thought, that an average Time Lord lifespan is probably about 1,000 years. So, if the first Doctor at this point is at least 300, and the Time Destructor, because Time Lords live far longer than humans, it is speeding up his aging. So he's going to be dying of old age, wearing a bit thin, a lot sooner than he would have. Now, finally, one last theory I want to bring up as well. My personal fan theory, for most of the Doctor's time, for most of the time determining the Doctor's age, because he spends most of his life on Earth, he's going by Earth years. But years on Gallifrey are probably shorter. I'll get more detail into this as well for a couple other Doctors, but I want to get these theories out of the way right now before we get to the regeneration. So again, these are my main three theories. I want to start off here with the first Doctor. So whenever determining the Doctor's age, we're going by Earth years, even though there are instances where he'll spend long periods of time off the Earth. So finally, we get to Season 4 episode The 10th Planet and the 12th Doctor story, Twice Upon a Time. The first Doctor, after having defeated the Cybermen on Mondas, his body is wearing a bit thin. He is finally beginning to die of old age. Now again, part of it is because his age has been speeding up faster because of what happened back in Season 3. So he leaves Ben and Polly. He has his last adventure with this 12th incarnation, which is technically his 14th life, because his first cycle was 13, and Capaldi's the start of the next cycle, that'd be 14 lives. So yeah, at this point, when the first Doctor regenerates of old age, he is 450 years old. And now, for the time being, I'm going to be giving two ages with each Doctor. The individual age, which is how long this Doctor lived, and the total age, how long the Doctor has lived, combining all of his lives. So the first Doctor regenerated at the age of 450, so his total age is 450. The second Doctor, Patrick Troughton. Now, from what I could find, Troughton has one of the shortest lifespans of any Doctor. Now, there is a few who will debate he lived longer, and I'll get to that at the end, but I'm not in that camp that he lived fairly a short amount of time. And the second Doctor, it's a little bit easy to figure out his age up until his finale, and that's where the reason why there's some split in the fandom for how long he actually lived. But I'll get to that in a few minutes. So his first episode, Power of the Daleks. It's like I said, it's after a couple stories with Hartnell in Season 4. Season 4 is mostly following the second Doctor. So he's now 1 year old, and as his individual age, but his total age, like I said, is 450. So, for the first season, he's traveling with Ben and Polly, and then he picks up Jamie. And then Ben and Polly leave, and then he travels with Jamie for a little while. Now, we don't know exactly how much time passes in between his first season and his second season, Season 5, but I'm going to assume a little bit of time has passed, and I'll explain why in a little bit. Then whenever he meets Victoria in the Tomb of the Cybermen, he and Jamie explain that they've been traveling for a while. That's why I think a little bit of time has passed, maybe just a few years at most. So then he explains to Victoria, oh, and also something I forgot to mention, he also travels with a 500-year diary as well. So he states to Victoria that going off in Earth years, or Earth terms, he would be over 450 years old. That is what also gives evidence to my theory I stated back with Hartnell, that when determining the Doctor's age, he's going by Earth years, which makes sense. I mean, I'm an American, so if I went to pretty much any other country in the world, I wouldn't be using miles and pounds as measurements. I would, after a few years, like say I went to Britain for 5 years, I'd probably end up be using kilometers and kilograms, just because, have to adapt in order to figure out, how to survive. So the Doctor probably does the same thing with his age. He's rounding and adjusting to Earth years. But the reason why I think Earth years are longer than Gallifreyan years, again, I'll get more detail this later, just because, with time, the longer the Doctor's been on Earth, he probably forgets how long the exact amount is in terms of Gallifreyan years compared to Earth years. So he's probably having to guess a lot. Plus, if he travels off the Earth a lot, and then he's on different planets where their time is different, he's got to readjust a lot. But again, my personal theory is that Gallifreyan years are a little bit shorter, and there's a little bit of evidence for this, and I'll get to some of it later. But yeah, just adding that up, this and what the second Doctor says here helps validate that theory. Additionally, for the next 2 seasons, the rest of Season 5 and Season 6, again, at most, maybe a couple of years passed. So, prior to the final story of his 3rd season, the War Games, at most, I would say at most 10 years passed. Again, that's at most, just because Jamie, who was there almost from his beginning, is still fairly young. Maybe some off-screen adventures could have happened in between seasons, but not that many. So, again, at most by the time of the War Games, I'd say he's probably around 5 to 10 years have passed total for the second Doctor. Then, at the end of the War Games, the second Doctor is confronted by the Time Lords, who decide to punish him by exiling him to Earth as part of basically his continually travelings, interfering with Earth's past as well as its future a few times. So ultimately, he's being forced to regenerate. But here's the thing. This is where the debate comes in. It involves his future appearances out through this episode, because the second Doctor reappears in the 3 Doctors, the 5 Doctors, and the 2 Doctors from the 6 Doctors era. But he does look older in each of these appearances. And they don't really give too much of an explanation about it, but here's my personal theory, and it goes with a few other theories that I've found on. Basically, the second Doctor, once he's basically being forced into exile, the Time Lords still need him. So he still has a few off-screen adventures, but he's basically being pulled forward through his time stream, which is also something I'll get into with the 3rd Doctor, with the 3 Doctors episode. Or it's the 3 Doctors movie, whatever. So the second Doctor is basically being forced forward through his time stream for various adventures or various missions that the Time Lords need him for, which is also something that happens both with the 3rd Doctor and the 4th Doctor. So the Time Lords still need the Doctor, but they're still punishing him. So they're basically cutting his life short, taking him just to key points in his future that they need him for, so that way they can basically force his regeneration upon him sooner. So that's why in the 3 Doctors, the 5 Doctors, and the 2 Doctors, he looks older. As well as how Jamie and Victoria reappear, even though their memories were essentially erased at the end of the War Games. So he probably does have a couple of adventures with them again, but that would also explain why, for example, in the 2 Doctors, Jamie is clearly an adult now. He's no longer a little kid. So, well, a young man, I should say, instead. So by the time, and I would say several decades at most pass with this, because again, we don't know how long these adventures last, but again, the Time Lords are forcing him to age faster in order to reach his point of regeneration, where he would die of old age. And this leads to a fan film. like I said with the first Doctor and at the beginning, I'm trying to be careful what I take that's not in the main show's canon, because like I said, this is a fan film, Devious, which was released in the 90s. Well, made in the 90s, I should say. I think it was released in the early 2000s. But anyway, now I consider, even though it's a fan film, I consider it canon, mainly just because Jon Pertwee himself appears in it. And in this film, the second Doctor is clearly an old man, and he no longer looks like himself, well, because it's a different actor. But he's finally regenerated into the third Doctor. By this point, this is the end of the second Doctor's life. I'm going to say the second Doctor grand total lived about, or his total age was 50. Second Doctor, like I said, lived for about 5-10 years prior to the War Games. But then, several decades pass as the Doctors force him to age and get closer and closer to his regeneration because they need him for certain missions. But then once they're finally done with him, then he can finally regenerate into the third Doctor in Devious. So, the Doctor's individual age is 50, his total age is about 500. The third Doctor, Jon Pertwee. Now, like I said, we don't know the exact age at which the second Doctor regenerated to the third. I'm just sticking with 500 for now because that's basically what I'm going off for my personal fan theory. And this is the problem. Not every Doctor's age when he regenerated or when he was regenerated is known and agreed upon by the fandom. So a few of these I'm going to have to guess. But thankfully, the third Doctor's age when he did regenerate into the fourth is agreed upon, but I'll get to that at the end. So, Spearhead from Space, the first story of Pertwee's first season, Season 7. So, we start over, the third Doctor is 1, but his total age is 500. Now, he does exaggerate a few times his age, and at one point he does, actually no, 2 points he states, once to Liz, in the episode Doctor Who and the Slytherins, I think is how you say them, that he was several thousand years old and had been a scientist for a very long time. Now, of course, obviously by this point, at most the Doctor is a little over 500 years old. But this goes back to my theory, and the one that I've read a few other people also agree upon in the fandom, that Gallifreyan years are different from Earth years. So by this point, he's talking about back on his first life when he was still in Gallifrey, as well as maybe some things he had done in his first second lives, even though second life not as likely. Maybe he was somewhat a scientist in his first life, but in his third life, he is more full-on scientist now. But he had been a scientist somewhat back on Gallifrey before he stole the TARDIS. This is also said again in the second season, The Mind of Evil. So, on the one hand, Pertwee, as the Doctor, could just be exaggerating his age. Maybe he meant to say several hundred years old instead of several thousand. And it could also be as a way of saying that, oh, I'm so intelligent, and because I've lived so much longer than you, you're just so insignificant to me. Because the third Doctor liked to exaggerate a lot. But nevertheless, by the Season 2 episode, his second season episode, The Mind of Evil, like I said, he could only be 2 or 3 years old. And at this point, he could just be just over 500 years. Now, maybe it is over 1,000 in Gallifreyan years. We don't know. But in Earth years, he's at around 2 or 3 years old. Total age around 500. Then we get to his fourth season, Season 10, The Three Doctors. Now, in this episode, the first Doctor appears on that monitor, and the second Doctor, looking slightly older but not too significantly older, appear together. And by this point, after a few years, the third Doctor's punishment and exile to Earth has been lifted. And this is what also leads to another fan theory, which I brought up a little bit with 1 and 2, but it really starts with 3. My personal theory here is that the Doctor, in order to help, I guess, for the Doctor Who fandom, for all these outside TV show stories, at least the ones that are considered canon to happen, they happen either in between seasons, or maybe in between some stories. The Doctor maybe takes a break, travels on his own for a little while, then goes back to right where he left off to continue the next season or the rest of the season. So basically, after the Three Doctors, when the Doctor's exile has been lifted, either before the end of this season, as well as in between seasons 4 and 5, his last season, my guess is that the Doctor will have several off-screen adventures. Or maybe he and his companions, because some of them are, sometimes he has adventures with his companions, but sometimes they're companions solely for off-screen adventures. So, in between seasons, or even in between certain stories, he'll just go off on his own, and he could be gone for a short period of time, or even for many years. And this is what will help explain the Doctor's huge leap in age by the time he regenerates at the end of Season 12, or Season 11, his final season. So, by this point, like I said, The third Doctor, following the three Doctors, is around 4 or 5 years old, assuming his first 4 seasons have occurred in real time, basically about one a year. So, after the end of this season, and Jo has left, and before Sarah Jane comes in, the Doctor probably spent a lot of time traveling again, but more than likely on his own. Which would make sense. If he had been exiled for a while and he couldn't travel as much as he did in his first 2 lives, the third Doctor wants to compensate by now just traveling for a long time. Still coming back to work for UNIT, since that was his job. But, for the most part, he's traveling on his own to other planets, other points in time, for years, if not decades at a time, and then coming back. So then finally, in his final season, where he was season 11 with Sarah Jane, that's when he starts traveling with her again, and that might take place over the course of about a year or so. So at the end of his 5th season, when John Pertwee regenerates at the end of the Planet of the Spiders, he regenerates at the age 248, and this age is confirmed by the 4th Doctor Pro's A Device of Death. So that would mean that if the first 4 seasons, like I said, around 4 or 5 years, the third Doctor spent over 200 years in between the 3 Doctors and the Planet of the Spider, or the beginning of season 5, and maybe even a few throughout season 5, traveling on his own for many years at a time. But that is the best explanation I can give, and it's easier here than a few other Doctors as to how that could be possible. So by the time, like I said, by the time the third Doctor regenerates in the 4th, he lived 248 years. Meaning, by this point, the Doctor is about 748 years old. Oh, no, he is 748, my bad. That is the age they give. So, yeah, and he traveled for about 240 years. My bad, I got that backwards. So he traveled for about 248 years, he lived about 248 years as the third Doctor, regenerated into the 4th Doctor at the age of 748. The 4th Doctor, Tom Baker. Now, Tom Baker is actually a pretty easy Doctor to figure out his age, because he's one of the few Doctors who regularly gives his age. So it is kind of surprising that he lived so much less than his 3rd incarnation, which will actually also be true for the next few incarnations as well. But I'll get to them when I get to them. So, in the season 12 first episode Robot, the 4th Doctor once again restarts his age at 1, but his total age is 748. And throughout his first, I think, 5-6 seasons, Tom Baker's Doctor constantly states his age. So, for example, in the episode Pyramids of Mars, in his 2nd season, he states that he was 750 years to Sarah. So that would mean, that means he's lived about 2 or 3 years, he's 750. He once again also states he's at least 750 to Layla in the season 4 episode, season 15, but his 4th season episode, The Robots of Death. So he's got to be anywhere between 750 and 759. So he's once again traveled for a few years, and maybe some time has happened in between, some adventures happen in between seasons again. Then we get to when he met Romana 1, and this comes back to what I had brought up back with the 1st Doctor as to why the agreed upon age when he stole the TARDIS was. So when he met Romana 1, she states that he had traveled for 523 years in the TARDIS. This was the season 16, his 5th season episode, The Ribos Operation. So meaning at this point, the 4th Doctor is at least 11, but is 11, and his total age is 759 years old. And this also confirms the theory earlier I had that Gallifreyan years are shorter than Earth years, because he said he was 756, so he had to kind of round his age to 756, but Romana explained no, it's 759, so he was a little bit short. So because Gallifreyan years are obviously less, that means there's way more of them than Earth years, he has to kind of round down to guess, but he'd round wrong. And again, there's a few other examples that also kind of go with this theory, but this is just one of them. So when he begins traveling with Romana 1 in his 5th season, like I said, he's 759. Then, at the end of this season, when he's assembling the key to time in the episode The Power of Kroll, he's 760, meaning he's at around 12 years old. Then he travels, then Romana 1 regenerates at the beginning of the 6th season into Romana 2. And this also would help explain how there's such a huge gap prior to when he regenerates into the 5th Doctor at the end of his 7th and final season. Now that the Doctor is once again traveling with a companion, but this time it's a Time Lord. Unlike pretty much every companion he's traveled with before that, who were humans, most of them from Earth, a Although there were some that were from like different points of time, not just like modern Earth. But they'd almost all been traveling with companions. So, if he had traveled with them at most for a few years each, it'd be noticeable if they had been traveling for a long time, because if the Doctor doesn't age that much physically, because Time Lords don't age physically that much, generally, it would be noticeable if he had traveled with, say, an Earth companion for 10 years, because they would have aged 10 years. But, because he's traveling with Romana, a time lady, they could travel for many years at a time, and I'm saying time a lot, and not physically show it. So, my guess is, throughout Season 5, Season 6, and the first part of Season 7, several decades pass where it's just him and Romana alone traveling the TARDIS. Now, there is like a companion like K9 who comes here and there, and maybe a couple of one-offs, but for the most part, there are probably plenty of off-screen adventures in between stories and seasons where it's just the Doctor and Romana too. So, that could explain why there's such a big gap, because at basically the end of Season 5, the fourth Doctor is 12, but his total age is 760. However, when we finally get to the end of Tom Baker's 7th and final season, Season 18, Logopolis, he is around he's over 800 years old, excuse me. So by the time of his 7th season, he's over 800. And then in Logopolis, his final story, he begins seeing the Watcher, that ghost-like figure, follow him around. And Romana's gone, and over the course of Season 7, the Doctor has picked up 3 human companions again. So that would mean, at most, once Romana's gone, maybe a year passes in Season 7. So once again, we're back to the show is happening the length of time that the show is on TV. So, in Logopolis, when the fourth Doctor falls to his death, stopping the Master, he is 813 years old, meaning the fourth Doctor lived 65 years. And this age is also validated by the fifth Doctor in his prose, Cold Fusion, which I'll get back to that in a minute when I talk about the fifth Doctor. So now, after the first 4 lives of the Doctor, Hartnell, Troughton, Pertwee, and Tom Baker, the Doctor has lived a little over 800 years. So a little bit around 200 each. And while the first Doctor died essentially of old age, but again, part of it was because he was aging faster. Second Doctor, he was forced to regenerate, but again, maybe it was forced regeneration where he is basically being pulled through his time stream. Third Doctor, it was basically experienced radiation poisoning after traveling to the planet of the spiders, and the fourth Doctor's fallen to his death. So every Doctor so far has died of a different form of death. But we're going to start seeing a few deaths repeat a lot, and radiation basically having its effects on the Doctor, basically force aging or even force regeneration. The fifth Doctor, Peter Davison. Now here's the thing. Peter Davison's Doctor, the fifth Doctor, is one of the easiest to explain his age, but one of the hardest to explain how that age makes sense. And now let me explain. Like I said, at the end with the fourth Doctor, in the fifth Doctor's prose, Cold Fusion, he states he regenerated, at the age of 813. So, the fifth Doctor starts out at the age 813. And then we get to the sixth Doctor. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I'll explain why in a sec. That he states he's 900 years old. Now, assuming that the sixth Doctor, when he first mentions this, that he's exactly 900, that would mean the fifth Doctor lived 87 years. Now, I know, why am I mentioning how long the fifth Doctor lived at the very beginning rather than the end like I did with the first 4? Because here's the problem. The fifth Doctor lived almost 90 years, but in his 3-season run, he is almost always with human companions. So here we have the problem. Going back, and this is why I mentioned this back with the fourth Doctor. And going back to my theory with the third. If the Doctor does constantly travel with humans, he can't be aging that much, because humans would physically, if they were traveling with the Doctor for many years at a time, they would show that they're aging. Time Lords don't age as fast as humans, though. So, if he's traveling with companions all the time for almost 90 years, they would be aging like crazy. Additionally, the problem with my theory that to help explain this, that a lot of adventures the Doctors have are off-screen adventures, and this is where basically things like audio dramas, novels, comics can take place, even then, he's almost always traveling with companions. Some are exclusive to those, but some of them are also the companions he traveled with in the show. So how could the Doctor possibly age 90 years in roughly 3 years or so? At least with the show. The closest I could get is simply that, and this leads to kind of go back to what I said with John Pertwee's Doctor, is that he might drop his human companions off back on Earth from time to time. Because there are times where the Fifth Doctor, is back on modern-day Earth. So, and maybe it is possible that there are some adventures in between the seasons. But again, he's one of the few Doctors that's always with companions. So, I wouldn't really know exactly where these breaks could work. Again, the best would be maybe in between seasons. But it also would feel somewhat out of character for at least the Fifth Doctor, because how much he actually likes being with his companions compared to some of the other Doctors. Like, he's not the grouchy old man. He's not the arrogant scientist, or angry or crotchety. Like, he likes being around human companions. So it also wouldn't make too much sense for him to abandon them for long periods of time to do adventures on his own, then come back to them. So like I said, while it is easy to do the math for the Fifth Doctor, if he regenerated at 813, and then he regenerates into his sixth incarnation at 987 years. And the only other time that I could find where the Fifth Doctor mentions his age is in one of his audio dramas, Omega, where he said he's to be pushing 900. So maybe he's at least 70 at the time of this audio drama. But again, we don't know exactly when this audio drama takes place. Now, he's not traveling with all of the companions he started off with by this point. So, again, some time must have passed, but then again, begs the question, when does he go off on his own for long periods of time? It would seem out of character for this Doctor. It's hard to find the exact point when he would do that, and for how long he would do that. So yeah, the math is easy to figure out for Peter Davis's Doctor. He lived 87 years, regenerated 900. It's just, explaining the math is kind of hard. The Sixth Doctor, Colin Baker. Now, Colin Baker has a similar issue with Peter Davison in that, in terms of doing the math with his age, is a little bit hard to explain, but it's a little bit easier to explain with Colin Baker than Peter Davison. So, when the Sixth Doctor regenerated in the Twin Dilemma, which was the final story of Peter Davison's final season, season 21, he regenerates, so he's 900 years total, but his individual age is now 1. So, in his first full season, season 22, he states to Perry in Revelation of the Daleks that he's 900 years old. So, again, there is some confirmation that he is 900, because he does mention it here as well as another time in his next season. In season 23, Trial of the Time Lord, though, here's the issue. So, assuming a little bit of time passes in between Twin Dilemma and season 22, his first full season, again, maybe 2 or 3 years pass, and then we get to Trial of the Time Lord. Now, before Trial of the Time Lord, which was season 23, there was a 18-month hiatus. Now, it is possible that the Doctor and Perry did have some off-screen adventures, as well as maybe him having off-screen adventures after Perry's death, which was shown in Trial of the Time Lord. I almost said Time of the Time Lord. Anyway, so it is possible that the Doctor did have some adventures, but at most it'd probably be maybe a few decades. Like I said, at most. I mean, he'd be, like I said, I can't get an exact age because it was kind of hard to find an exact age for this theory, because this one, like I said, is a fan theory. So by the time the Trial of the Time Lord happens, because the Third Doctor's hair is different, and he's no longer traveling with Perry, he's now traveling with Mel, a few decades have passed, but again, probably not too much, maybe at most 30 years, again, at most, but realistically it might even be closer to 20. So the Trial of the Time Lord happens, we see past stories, present stories, future stories, then the Doctor once again is vindicated by the Time Lords, he's allowed to leave, thankfully he's not forced to regenerate like the second one was, and he and Mel go off to do some more adventures. And again, probably some would be off-screen. Now, again, I have not heard too many audio dramas for pretty much anything of Doctor Who, so I don't know how many are considered canon and not canon. But there's very little after that I find that take place after Trial of the Time Lord that really give the Sixth Doctor's age. So there really is no exact amount of time he does travel after Trial of the Time Lord. That's, again, like the main part is to figure out where it falls in his lifespan. So again, after Trial of the Time Lord, Sixth Doctor probably has some more off-screen adventures, and then finally we get to the time of the Ronnie. the first story of season 24. Now, Baker was basically canned after season 23 ended, and then Sylvester McCoy got hired onto the show to be the next Doctor. So, Sixth Doctor regenerates at the very beginning of season 24 in the time of the Ronnie. Now, later, Sylvester McCoy states that his age is 953 years old, the same as the Ronnie's. Now, one last little thing. We don't know exactly what lifespan, or, excuse me, not lifespan, what incarnation this Ronnie is, if it's the first one or not. Probably not. But I doubt it'd also be the sixth Ronnie. But again, we don't know for sure, at least which incarnation of the Ronnie this is at this time. At least I couldn't find it anyway. But yeah, off topic there. Point is, by the time the Sixth Doctor regenerates into the Seventh, the Seventh Doctor is 953. So the Doctor's age by this point is 953. So if the Sixth Doctor basically was regenerated, or Fifth Doctor regenerated the Sixth Doctor at the age of 900, that would mean the Sixth Doctor lived for 53 years, less than the Fifth Doctor, and his total age by this point is 953. The Seventh Doctor, Sylvester McCoy. So, going back to what happened with at the end of the Sixth Doctor's era, in time of the Ronnie, he's exposed to radiation poisoning and regenerates into the Seventh Doctor. And since it was, and in this episode, the Seventh Doctor explains that his age is 953, the same age as the Ronnie. So, we don't know exactly how much the Seventh Doctor ages in his 3-season run. But if I were to guess, I'd say maybe about a year passes with him with Mel, and then after Mel leaves, a few years or so, he's with Ace. So basically, when season 26, the final Old Who season, is over, we can assume the Doctor is almost 960 years old. Then we also can assume that there are some off-screen adventures afterwards. For example, in the Seventh Doctor Pro's Set Piece, he's still traveling with Ace, and he celebrated his 1000th birthday. And here's the thing, because I could not find a concrete, agreed-upon answer in the fandom as to what happens with Ace, because in the Doctor Who TV movie, the Seventh Doctor's traveling alone by this point, and he has aged physically, because it was, almost a decade between this movie and when season 26 ended. But Ace is no longer with them, so, like I said, I don't know exactly what happened to Ace, but at some point, Ace has either left by choice or something happened to her, and now the Doctor's been traveling alone for a while. Because again, it's hinted that Ace has been gone for a while by the time the TV movie happens. But whenever the Doctor regenerates, in the 8th Doctor Pro's Vampire Science, he claims he was 1,009 years old as his total age when he regenerated from the 7th Doctor to the 8th Doctor. So, we're going to assume that is how old that one's true, because again, in the movie, they don't actually state his age. This was the best I could get. So, if the 7th Doctor regenerated whenever he was 1,009 years old, that would mean that the 7th Doctor lived for 56 years. So, and in the movie, whereas his last two incarnations, in a sense, have been poisoned with radiation, 7th Doctor, the brilliant Machiavellian chess master, got shot to death. So it's interesting to see how that happened. I think even in another audio drama, 7th Doctor, when he encountered one of his future selves, pointed out how funny that was. Well, I guess ironic would be a better term. But yeah, so at this point, after his first 7 lives, the Doctor has reached 1,000 years old. And after having lived 56 years, he lived a little bit longer than his 3rd incarnation, but still less than his 5th and 4th incarnations. And again, at best, still more than the 2nd. So at least at this point, looking at all the old school era TV, Old Who Doctors, 2nd Doctor still lived the least amount of time. 1st Doctor still lived the most amount of time. And the 1st Doctor is the only one who, again, succumbed to old age, having regenerated when his body wore a bit thin at 450. And then, of course, the 3rd Doctor, the only other one who made it to around like 250 years of age. The 8th Doctor, Paul McGann. Alright, so here's the thing. Going back to something I brought up near the beginning, I'm trying to stick with the main TV series continuity to determine the 8th Doctor's age. But we've reached 2 issues when it comes to the 8th Doctor. One, almost all the 8th Doctor's run, or era, whatever you want to call it, does not occur in the show itself. It occurs through novels, audio dramas, comics, etc. So, and because I've mostly just seen the TV show, not so much from extended outside of show universe stories, it's hard for me to determine what are the main ones that are considered canon and what's not considered canon. Additionally, with the Eighth Doctor, we have the whole issue of the age. So, if the Seventh Doctor regenerates to the Eighth when he's over 1,000 years old, how can the Doctor, when the revived series begins with Rose in 2005, the episode, and in Season 1, when Christopher Eccleston's Doctor says he's 900. So we have those two big issues. Well, it took a lot of research, particularly for both the Eighth Doctor and the War Doctor. And again, I still have a couple of issues, but since this is all personal fan theory, this is the answer I'm going to go with for now. So, for the Eighth Doctor, in the Doctor TV movie, when the Seventh Doctor is shot to death, and he dies due to having the botched surgery and a combination of the anesthesia that affects his body, he eventually regenerates, but has partial amnesia, and throughout the movie he regains his memories. But again, going back to the Eighth Doctor prose, Vampire Science, he states that he was 1,109 when he regenerated, so that means the Eighth Doctor is now 1 year old when he's in the United States, and he died. So, to determine the age of the Doctor, I went to the Doctor Who Wikia and looked up, basically, referring to the Night of the Doctor, I looked up what are considered the Eighth Doctor's main stories, audio dramas, and all that, and then looked for the ones that had the companions he calls out in Night of the Doctor. Like, he calls out like 5 companions before he regenerates into the War Doctor. So I tried looking for those main ones, because obviously those are the ones that are considered canon, at least since they're the ones that he acknowledged. So I'm only going to bring up for the Eighth Doctor the main ones I could find that also work with the theory for his age. So, going back to the prose of Vampire Science, he says he lost count of his age and decided to starting over with this current life. So, instead of saying he's 1,012, he's decided to just go by the age of 3. So that means, from now on, whenever the Doctor is giving his age, he's off by over 1,000 years. And from this point forward, I'm going to be giving 3 ages for the Doctor. The individual age, how long this Doctor has lived, the total age, how long the Doctor says they have lived, and the grand total age, which is when you add in this over 1,000 years the Doctor chooses to omit. And think of it like someone who's maybe in their mid-40s, and when they go out to see someone for the first time, they're like, oh yeah, I'm about 40. They're taking away a few years to make themselves not sound as old. Now, admittedly, in the grand scheme of being a Time Lord, I don't know how this works, but this is the best, and again, some of this is what I could find from Wikia and other, I guess, fan sites that talk about the Doctor's age and the time, particularly one site I found of an article that talks about the Time War itself. This is the best explanation that addresses all these plot holes. So additionally, with the Eighth Doctor, there is one audio he has called Orbis. Now, in that audio, he spent 600 years on a planet. And assumedly by this point, the Eighth Doctor had been around for probably 150 to 200 years, since this is implied somewhere more in the middle of his life when this story takes place. Now, this also goes back to the other theory I mentioned a few times, which is, if the Doctor spends enough time on another planet, he's going to be going by their years and no longer Gallifreyan or Earth years. Because if what my research about the Eighth Doctor is true, he did not live over 600 years. So he's probably referring to 600 years from this planet. So I'm going to assume maybe, and plus he's still traveling with the same companion once the story's over, that would mean that planets, similar with Gallifrey, the years being shorter, he's spending 600 years of this planet's years on this planet. But again, he'd probably be, my best guess, around 190 years old whenever he does this. So that would mean his individual age and his total age are around 190. But his grand total age is around 1,200. And again, he still has a few more adventures here and there, but again, I'm trying to be careful of the ones I could find to determine the age. Because at one point, there's one that says he's just about 1,000, even though, again, Vampire Science said he was already over 1,000. But then there was another one that said he was like 1,500, although that math probably can't work, given what happens later with the War Doctor, and I'll explain that in a minute. But then finally we get to the Night of the Doctor itself, where the Eighth Doctor finally, after 20 years, finally gets the opportunity to have a regeneration story. And from what I could find, and again, this one was from an article I could find talking about the Time War. So from what we know of the Time War, it lasted about 400 years, though it could have gone a little bit longer. It's because there is no exact perfect answer. The closest I could find was a little over 400 years. Now it's also implied that the Time War had basically started to get underway, but it wasn't really at its peak yet when he was still the 8th Doctor. But then, once he crashes on Karn, and the Sisterhood revives him just for a few minutes, the 8th Doctor decides to regenerate by drinking that potion that turns him into a warrior. But from what I could find, the 8th Doctor at this point is 403 years old. So the 4th Doctor lived 403 years, and since he already decided to restart his age to basically reflect this life and kind of ignoring the first 7, or at least restarting with this one after the first 7, his individual age and total age are both 403, but his grand total age is 1,412. Because again, you add in the 1,009 years he basically omitted now that he's decided to restart with this life. So again, this is something that's going to happen with every Doctor from this point forward. I'm going to give the individual age, total age, and grand total age. So again, the 8th Doctor, when he crashed on the Karn and decided to regenerate into a warrior, John Hurt's Doctor, that was 403 years, and grand total age was 1,412. The War Doctor, John Hurt. Now, John Hurt's War Doctor has a similar issue with Paul McGann's 8th Doctor in that there is not that much within the show itself that really gives us a good idea about his age, and he has far less of the extended universe of Doctor Who than Paul McGann does, mainly because John Hurt sadly died a couple of years after the Day of the Doctor. So there's very little I could find, even in the extended universe of Doctor Who, that really gives us an understanding of his age, so this one's going to be pretty short. But and again, there is going to be a lot of division amongst this one, as well as for the 9th Doctor, which I'll get to in a second, when really figuring out his age. Going back to what I said to earlier, not every Doctor, the age when he regenerated into his current form, or his current incarnation, and then regenerated into the next incarnation ages, are confirmed by the show itself and agreed upon by the fandom. And the same is true for the War Doctor, but in this case, it's both ages. Now, like I said, the one I could find for the 8th Doctor was on an article about the Time War, but even then, that still might be up for debate. But that's why. But I just went with 403. Just stick with that. But as for the War Doctor, we don't really know for sure the age he became the War Doctor or the age he was no longer the War Doctor. So a lot of this is going to be speculation, but this was the best I could find. So if the 8th Doctor regenerated into the War Doctor when he was 403, and his grand total age was 1,412, that would mean that the War Doctor was 403, and 1,412 when his life began. Now, we don't know the exact age that the Time War lasted, but the closest I could find was a little over 400 years. So and from what I've also read, the War Doctor did not actually fight all 403 years of the war. Or all the over 400 years of the Time War. So, I mean, it makes sense. I mean, soldiers go on leave or might go home eventually. So it's assumed that the War Doctor fought for most of the Time War, but he probably didn't fight every single year of the Time War. So, and from what I could find, there are a few off-screen adventures, like he does travel with other companions at one point, like in some of the comics. So the War Doctor did have more to his life than just the Time War. But again, the closest I could find, by the time we reach the Day of the Doctor, he's very old, he's wearing a bit thin, like he's worn out, he's had enough. By this point, the War Doctor has been fighting for about 420 years in the Time War. And again, it went on a little bit at the end of the 8th Doctor's life. So if in Day of the Doctor, he basically regenerates basically the day of or the day after the Time War is over, the closest age I could find was that the War Doctor was over 400 years old. Somewhere between 400 and 450 is basically what I could find amongst the fandom. But the age I'm going to go with, because again, this is my personal theory, and this is a combination of other information I could find online, I'm going to assume the War Doctor regenerated into the 9th Doctor when he was 417 years old. Meaning he lived 417 years, fought over 400 years in the Time War, and that his total age by this point is 820. And I'm going to explain this a little bit more when we get to the Ninth Doctor, as well as a little bit with the 11th Doctor. But again, if the total age of the Doctor by this point is now 820, his grand total age is 1,829. And this brings up one last point, going back all the way to the first Doctor again. Now, I want to correct myself slightly. I had said back with the first Doctor, I'm going to assume that if a Time Lord could reach basically a full life, die of old age naturally, that would be about 1,000 years. I meant to say closer to 700 to 800 years. And I'm going to explain why I need to make this correction when I get to Matt Smith's Doctor. But yeah, so I'm going to assume a Time Lord, if they can reach long life, die of old age, would be around 700 to 800 years. But again, with the first Doctor, the first one to die of old age, wearing a bit thin, part of it I'm going with the whole his sped up aging. And second Doctor, again, somewhat reaching old age, but again, it was more forced regeneration throughout his time stream to get there sooner. And then the next 5 Doctors all basically died of other causes, falling to his death, some form of poisoning or radiation, and then, of course, 7th Doctor getting shot, and then the 8th Doctor crashing. War Doctor, though, lived a little bit less than his first incarnation, but just a little bit longer than his 8th incarnation. So, how is it that he could also die of old age, then? Because, don't get me wrong, the 8th Doctor physically got a lot older as well. So then how did the 8th War Doctor die of old age, then, if he lived only about 417 years? Well, my personal fan theory is that fighting the war for so long physically drained him of all of his energy. So by the time the Time War is finally over, ironically, the War Doctor is probably one of only a couple that died at peace. So the War Doctor, basically, the Time War was just such a heavy burden for him that when he finally regenerated, his body had worn a bit thin just at the right time. So that's how he could also die of old age, wearing a bit thin, at even less time than the first Doctor, but only slightly longer than the 8th Doctor. So that's how we got it. 417 years, total age would be 820, grand total age 1,829. Okay, now we're up to the point in New Who era Doctor Who TV shows. And thankfully, for the most part, the TV show is a bit more consistent at, 1, bringing up the Doctor's age, and 2, trying to basically make sure that, at least within the show itself, the Doctor's time links are explained in a ways that make sense. But there are still a few issues here and there, and one of the ones is a division among the fandom, whether or not the 9th Doctor lived a very short period of time, or about a century. I'm in the latter portion of that group, and I already explained part of it with the War Doctor, but I'm going to get into more detail here, as well as a little bit more with the 11th Doctor. So, Christopher Eccleston is the 9th Doctor now. And in the very first episode, Rose, there's actually elements, and as well as the second episode, there are some elements that confirm both fan theories, that the 9th Doctor lived for only about a few years, or about a century. On the one hand, it's implied that he recently just regenerated, since, like when he looks at himself for the first time in the mirror, it acts like it's the first time he's seen his face. But also in Rose, it's implied there are some off-screen adventures he's had by himself, traveling for a while after the Time War ended, just on his own, before he finally has, I guess, decided to take up a new companion in the form of Rose. But again, I'm sticking with the idea that the 9th Doctor had been around for a while before he finally, basically, the show begins. So, the day of the Doctor, when the War Doctor regenerated the 9th Doctor, again, that means he's 1, total age 820, grand total age 1829. And there were several decades of adventures he had, including at one point stopping a family from going on Titanic, witnessing the Kennedy assassination, as well as a few other events as well. So I'm guessing about 75 years pass in between the day of the Doctor, when the 9th Doctor's incarnation begins, to meeting Rose. So he's at least 895 years old. Then, in Season 1, when he finally meets Rose, he's almost 900. Because, again, about a year or two passes, I think, in Season 1. So, when Aliens of London finally hits, he says he's 900 to Rose. So, that would mean about 80 years have passed. He's almost 900, grand total age, almost 1909. Then, finally, in The Parting of Ways, whenever he's exposed to the, I forgot what it was. Basically, whenever he saves Rose's life, but it has that radiation effect on his body, once again forces him to regenerate. So, in The Parting of Ways, the Doctor's individual age by this point was 80, his total age is 900, and his grand total age is 1909. And this addresses that plot hole I brought back with the 8th Doctor. How could he be over 1,000, but then the 9th Doctor say to Rose he's 900? Well, this is how. The Time War, the 8th Doctor lived about 400 years or so. The War Doctor fought in the Time War for about 400 years or so. And a little bit less than a century passes with the 9th Doctor before he meets Rose. That gives us that whole period of time in between, and that's how that works. So yeah, 9th Doctor, lived 80 years, but now his total age is 900. Grand total age for the 9th Doctor would be 1909. And that basically gets us all caught up with the Doctor's age to fix the essentially plot hole that basically was created when the show came back. Now we're up to the 10th Doctor, David Tennant. He's actually one of the easiest to once again figure out the age for the Doctor, but remember back what I said with the 2nd Doctor, how he lived one of the shortest lives? Well, he didn't live the shortest. That would be David Tennant's Doctor. Now, at least in terms of the show, figuring out the Doctor's age is pretty easy. But, again, if you also try to take into account off-screen adventures, it is a bit of a stretch to assume he lived the length he did. Because, quick reminder, the 10th Doctor technically got 2 incarnations. So, how all this managed to fit in 2 lives but still be so short is kind of surprising. I don't know if this is the fault on Russell T Davies or Stephen Moffat, but either way, it is a bit of a pill. It's hard to swallow, but for the most part, I can still believe it. It's just a bit of a stretch. So, in the Christmas Invasion, when the 9th Doctor regenerated the 10th Doctor, he is now 1 year old, total age is 900, grand total age 1,909. Then about 2 years pass with his first season when he's traveling with Rose, and then we get to a couple of adventures prior to him meeting Martha, and including when he encountered Donna the first time in The Runaway Bride. So then finally when we get to Voyage of the Damned, he says to the survivors that I'm the Doctor, I'm 903 years old, and I'm going to save all your lives. I'm paraphrasing, but essentially what David Tennant's Doctor said at this point. So in Voyage of the Damned, if he's 903 years old, his individual age is 3. And for the most part, this kind of makes sense given how much time in the show has passed since his time as the Doctor began. So that would mean his total age, and I don't know if this was intentional or not, but the fact that this is where the math adds up is amazing. By the time of Voyage of the Damned, the 10th Doctor's total age, or the Doctor's total age, 1,912. When was the Titanic's maiden voyage? 1912. I don't know how they got that to work, but again, if his individual age is 3, and his total age is 903, his grand total age is 1,912 years old. Again, I don't know how this worked out, but it worked out to be an amazing coincidence. Probably one of the best in all of Doctor Who. But anyway, so then we continue on with David Tennant's run. Eventually, he is shot by a Dalek, and he is forced to regenerate, but instead of regenerating into a new body altogether, the residual regeneration energy is given to the severed hand he lost back in the Christmas Invasion. So now, the 10th Doctor has gotten a second life, his 12th incarnation's life, since the War Doctor took 9, 9 took 10, 10 is the 11th incarnation, now 10's second incarnation is his 12th life. So, at this point, he regenerated, but only about halfway to still be David Tennant. So then we get to Day of the Doctor. He states that he's 904 years old. So far, the 10th Doctor's lived 4 years. Again, a bit of a stretch for the most part, but at least with the show itself, it is believable. It's just when you get to off-screen adventures with him and Rose, him and Martha, him and Donna, it'd be kind of hard to assume all that takes place in maybe 4.5 years. Then finally, a little bit more time after Day of the Doctor happens, and then he finally regenerates in the end of time into after he basically has to sacrifice himself, exposed to the radiation, in order to save Wilt's life and defeat the Master. So by this point, whenever he has his final goodbye to all his companions and he finally regenerates, the 10th Doctor only lived 6 years, which is an incredibly short amount of time. And again, he got 2 lives out of this, but it's just the way it worked out because he's 906 years old when he regenerates from the 10th Doctor to the 11th Doctor. And his grand total age is 1,915 years old. So again, that's just where unfortunately he fell. Again, I don't know if this was on the fault of Davies or Moffat, but unfortunately the 10th Doctor, despite getting 2 lives, lived very, very brief. It'd be like if a college kid had one basically bender weekend where he went crazy with the drinking or drugs, and then he completely forgot about that weekend. In the grand scheme of the Doctor's life, 6 years is not that much, as we will see. The 11th Doctor, Matt Smith. Now, Matt Smith brings up his age a lot, but there is a bit of an issue with his age at the very end, and I'll get to that and give a close explanation I can give with another fan theory. So, early on in his first season, Season 5, when he's meeting Amy Pond, he explains to her that he is 907 years old, meaning that his total age is 916, and once again, individual age is 1. Now, whenever he meets President Nixon and after he, because again the whole timeline thing with season 6 is a bit confusing. In The Impossible Astronaut, after his companions witness his apparent death, he reveals that he is 909 years old, which means about 2 years have passed since the beginning of his first season. And he did go off on his own for a little while, but apparently not that long. So, throughout the course of season 6, the whole plot is to figure out who is the astronaut that shot the Doctor, and then it's revealed in the Reddit of River Song, and then again here by the same Doctor, that he is 1,103, meaning this individual Doctor's age is 196. So within his first 2 seasons, the 11th Doctor lived almost 200 years, and his grand total age by this point is 2,112 years old. Then, when we get to Season 3, A Town Called Mercy, when he encountered the gunslinger, he claimed he was 1,200 years old exactly, meaning by this point, his individual age is 293 years old, and his grand total age is 2,209 years old. So now, the Doctor is more than twice the age he was when he restarted his age the first time. Because keep in mind, the 8th Doctor decided to basically start over his age from the 1009 of his first 7 lives. But now, by this point, it's more than twice that when he restarted. So, his age is basically more than doubled since, you get what I'm trying to say. The amount of time from the first 7 lives is now the next 5 lives was basically that same amount. And then finally, we get to the end of his Day of the Doctor, with Day of the Doctor. Now, Amy and Rory are gone, and he's been traveling with Clara for a little while. Whenever he encounters his War incarnation and his 10th incarnation, the War Doctor asks him, "So how old are you now?" And he says, 1,200 and something, I think. And he kind of brings up how he's somewhat lost count. And finally, this goes back to the point I brought up with the War Doctor and why I gave him the age I did. I said that the War Doctor regenerated when he was 820 years old and had fought in the Time War and lived a little bit over 400 years. Well, by this point, the reason why I give that explanation is that the War Doctor says, "You're 400 years older than me, and you never bothered to count them," referring to the children Gallifrey, who they thought died. If the 11th Doctor by this point is 1,200 and something, or in this case 1,220, that would mean that he's 400 years older than the War Doctor, who's about to basically end his life to regenerate. That would mean that the War Doctor would be 820. And I've already explained how the math makes sense, going from the 8th Doctor restarting his age to the 9th Doctor being 900, and this is how I explain that. If the War Doctor basically is 400 years younger than the 12th Doctor, and at this point the 12th Doctor is about 1,220, that would mean that the 8th Doctor is 820. The War Doctor is 820. Then the 9th Doctor lives for about a century. The 10th Doctor lives for about 6 years. And at this point, the 11th Doctor has been alive for about 313 years. Meaning that his total age is, like I said, is about 1,220. And his grand total age is 2,229 years old. And then we get to finally the time of the Doctor, his regeneration story, and the Christmas special, his final Christmas special, Matt Smith's final Christmas special, sorry. So by this point, he had been traveling for Clara for a little while as well, but then finally when he gets to Trenzalore to help, basically, to do his mission to protect this planet, and in hopes to also help protect the Time Lords themselves, he basically tricks Clara into the TARDIS, and she goes back to Earth. Then she finds a way to get back to Trenzalore, and by this point, the 11th Doctor is finally starting to come of age, because he has been on this planet defending it for 300 years. And then he basically gives that long speech to Clara how he is the last incarnation, because the War Doctor, while he didn't count him as part of his life at the time as the Doctor, he was still an incarnation, and then the 10th Doctor got 2 incarnations. So by this point, the 11th Doctor is 613 years old, total age would be 1,520 years old, grand total age 2,529 years old. So by this point, the 11th Doctor has lived longer than any incarnation up to this point. And yes, he's finally starting to look old. And this goes to another personal fan theory as to one other thing that happens with the 11th Doctor. So, the Doctor once again tricks Clara back into the TARDIS, and then she goes back to Earth. Then she finds a way to return to Trenzalore again. And this time, the 11th Doctor looks very, very old. And some people pointed this out as well. And with the old makeup the 11th Doctor, Matt Smith's Doctor, has, he almost looks a bit like William Hartnell again. And this goes to the fan theory that some people have, though this one is more debatable, that a Time Lord's last incarnation, they look similar to how they did with their first incarnation. Now, yes, Hartnell did not have the same dark brown hair that Matt Smith has, but the fact that Matt Smith's Doctor, whenever he's really, really old in this scene, like whenever he's basically confronting the Daleks, you've been trying to kill me for centuries. If you want something done right, do it yourself. Like, when he looks a lot like Hartnell did. And I think I'm in that camp that agrees that was intentional. So my theory is that a Time Lord's last life basically reflects what they look like with their first life. And part of this theory also will come back with Peter Capaldi in a minute. But here's the problem with the age of the Doctor. Going back to what I tried to say with the first Doctor and the correction I gave a few minutes ago, that my guess is that a Time Lord would reach old age and die of old age around 700 to 800 Earth years. Well, by this point, the 11th Doctor spent another 600 years on Trenzalore, meaning he's been on Trenzalore for 900 years, but he already lived 300 years before that. So he's 1,213 years old. That is more than his first 7 incarnations combined, which is why I brought that up earlier with the 11th Doctor as well. So, if he's 1,213 years old, his total age is 2,120, and his grand total age is 3,129 years old. So, if my theory that a Time Lord reaches old age around 700 or 800 years, how could Matt Smith's Doctor live 1,200 years? Well, this was brought up by someone else who did a video about the Doctor's age on YouTube. I forgot which one it was, though. He brought up that he believed that the Time Lords are actually slowing down his aging, or at the very least helping him live longer until his mission on Trenzalore is complete. So kind of the opposite of what happened with the second Doctor, whereas they forced the regeneration upon him. Here, they're trying to keep him alive as long as possible because they know this is the Doctor's 13th and final incarnation. So if he dies, he's no longer going to be able to defend Trenzalore, and that brings a great risk to the Time Lords. So, and also with the cracks in time, they basically give him the new regeneration. Then all the Daleks over the planet Trenzalore are defeated, and then his life cycle, he's given a brand new life cycle, starting over with a brand new Doctor. So, basically at the end of this cycle of 13 lives, like I said, 3,100 years have passed, or 3,129 years have passed. And the individual age of the 11th Doctor was 1,213, which again, if he regenerated old age, they probably extended it by about 400 or 500 years. And the Doctor's total age by this point was 2,120 years old when he begins his new incarnation, or his new cycle. The 12th Doctor, and the first of the Doctor's second life cycle, Peter Capaldi. Now, Peter Capaldi also mentions his age a few times, but there's going to be one element here I'm going to basically, it's once again more of a personal fan theory regarding his age. So, in Deep Breath, the 12th Doctor states to Clara, I have lived over 2,000 years. Now, again, if he's still taking away the 1,009 years that basically when you start his age as the 8th Doctor, this statement would still ring true. He is now 1 as the 12th Doctor, but his total age would be 2,120. And grand total age 3,129. So, in that sense, to Clara, when he's telling that to Clara, that is true. So, once again, an explanation regarding a previous era with plot hole with the Doctor's age explained here. 2,120 years because he lived so long on Trenzalore. That's how it got to over 2,000. Now, first season happens, season 8 happens, about a year or so passes. Then, here's the thing. This is the personal fan theory, because I've yet to find anyone else who seems to agree with me on this one, but I'm still going to stick with it for now. In Last Christmas, after the Doctor had basically dropped Clara off at the end of season 8 and had been searching for Gallifrey on his own for a while, and it's basically like an Inception Christmas story, for lack of a better term, at one point he returns to Clara and sees her as an old woman. And he believes that he'd been gone for so long that he returned to a point where Clara's now old. Now, a lot of people say, oh no, basically only about a year passed, or a year or so passed in between the end of Season 8 and Last Christmas. But I personally believe it was a lot longer than that. Because why would the Doctor, because he's done this many times, where he'll go away for a while, then come back. So why would he think that Clara's really old this time? Even if he is still in the nightmare. My personal theory is that the Doctor was searching for Gallifrey, because he wouldn't do that after what happened with Missy, revealing the Gallifrey's still out there somewhere. He wouldn't do that for just like a year or so. He'd spend a long time searching. He even stated that he spent a long time searching for Gallifrey. Like, he wouldn't just give up that easily after only like a year or so. So my personal theory is that about 40 years pass, because why would he think Clara went from this young woman to this older woman, unless he had been searching for a long time, and as it's implied, particularly with Capaldi's Doctor a couple times, he's really bad at remembering how time is different for humans compared to Time Lords. Now, this came up a lot with Doctors in the past, but it comes up a lot with Capaldi's Doctor in particular. So, again, assuming about 40 years pass in between the end of Season 8 and Last Christmas, that would mean Capaldi's Doctor is 41 years old. He's 2,160 as his total age. Grand total age, 3,169. Now, again, I couldn't really find too many other people in the fandom who agree with me on this, but I'm sticking with this for now. However, then we get at the end of his second season, Season 9, he spent 4.5 billion years in his confession dial. But, technically, the Doctor didn't physically age. It's kind of like in the movie Groundhog Day. Bill Murray lived the same day over and over again many times, but he didn't actually physically age. He's just mentally a lot older than he is physically. So it's the same thing here. So, but again, assuming about a year passes for Season 9, then that would mean that the 12th Doctor, is 42 years old. He's 2,161, and his grand total age is 3,170 years old. So he didn't age during Heaven Sent when he was in the confession dial, but again, if every season is about a year or so, then that's how we get to 42. About a year or so for Season 1, about 40 years in between Season 1 and 2, and then about a year for Season 2 itself. Then, following Heaven Sent and Hellbent, we get to the Husbands of Riversong, where the 12th Doctor spent 24 years on Beryllium with Riversong, and then finally, assuming he's not immediately afterwards, shortly afterwards, maybe she has a couple more side stories as well, Riversong then goes back to the library, and that's where she encounters the 10th Doctor, which is something I forgot to mention with the 10th Doctor. So by this point, after 24 years on Beryllium, I'm going to assume that the 12th Doctor is 66 years old, total age 2,185, grand total age 3,194 years old. Then, after Riversong leaves, he encounters the boy from the Return of Dr. Mysterio, I forgot, Grant, I think was his name, and but also at this time, he's also been guarding the vault of Missy's body. And he was given this task to basically guard the body of Missy for 1,000 years. Now, in the pilot, the premiere of his final season, Season 10, she states that he's been doing this for 70 years. Now, I'm not going to assume that he just picked a random point in Earth history and would just guard this vault for 70 years. No, I bet and it's implied he and Nardal, again with the Return of Dr. Mysterio, still have some adventures, including what happens with Grant. So, because at the beginning, it's just the Doctor by himself, but then once Grant is an adult, Nardal is with him. So I'm going to assume this story takes place in between that 70-year gap between the Husbands of Riversong and the pilot. So by this point, the Doctor had been traveling with Nardal for a while as well. And when we get to the beginning of Season 3, the pilot, I'm going to assume that the 12th Doctor is 136 years old. His total age is 2,255. Grand total age is 3,264. Then finally, at the end of Season 10, the Doctor falls. when the Doctor is basically both attacked by the Cybermen and basically in that explosion, he is basically beginning to regenerate. Bill puts his body back into the TARDIS, but he refuses to regenerate. So then he decides that he's just tired of regenerating. He's done this so many times, he's tired of living as somebody else. Then we get to Twice Upon a Time, where he encounters his first incarnation. Then the two of them have that story with the new version of Bill and the captain, Lethbridge Stewart, who's revealed to be the Brigadier's grandfather. So by this point, again, about another year passed for Season 3. That would mean that when the 12th Doctor regenerates into the 13th, he lived 137 years. Now, again, you can take away 40 years if you don't agree with me on the whole him spending about 40 years searching for Gallifrey, and the 4.5 billion years didn't affect him physically as aging. But at least mentally, yeah, no question. The 12th Doctor lived longer than probably any possible way an incarnation is ever going to live. Unless they find a way to make a future Doctor basically be stuck in their head for 5-6 billion years. There's no way a future Doctor is going to live longer, or last longer, I should say, than the 12th Doctor did. But at least physically, like I said, if you don't count the 40 years, that would mean that the 12th Doctor lived for just under a century. But I'm going to assume that, again, 137 years. I am going to stick with that 40 years searching for Gallifrey. And that would mean 137 years is the Doctor's individual age. Total age, 2,256. And then finally, grand total age, when the 12th Doctor regenerates into the 13th, 3,265 is their age. And now we end on the current Doctor, the 13th Doctor, Jodi Whittaker, the first female to portray the Doctor. Now, so far after the first season, the 13th Doctor has not stated her age once. So, here's the thing. If we assume about a year has passed in the first season from the woman who fell to Earth, well then obviously she's 1 year old, and the total age is still 2,256 or 2,257 if she celebrated her birthday, and grand total age is still 3,265. So, by this point, like I said, we don't know how much time has passed throughout Season 11, or how much time will pass when we get to Season 12, but at the very least, we can at least say this. At the very least, the Doctor, just going by the age they like to give, they're at least 2,200 years old, and the grand total age, like I said, is at least 3,200 years old, since we got to take about a little over 1,000 years off. So that's where I'm going to end this video. Not really that much I can say with 13th Doctor, just wanted to end it on this. So again, by this point, that is where we stand with the Doctors, how old the Doctor is, the age of the Doctor, how long they lived, whatever you want to call it. The Doctor has lived for over 2,200 years old according to themselves, but grand total age is over 3,200 years. And yep, that brings it into this video. If you've stuck through all this and you heard me out, thank you very much. I appreciate your viewership. If you like this video, click the like button, share this video, subscribe, comment, and hopefully I'll get back with you to more videos in the future. Thanks, everybody. Take care.